Welcome to Medieval History Channel 97, where the echoes of the past come alive. Step into the world of knights, castles, and forgotten legends as we journey through time together. Let history speak. Welcome, dear listener, to this intimate journey through the humble and often harsh culinary world of medieval times. As you settle into this quiet moment, I invite you to pause, breathe, and imagine yourself stepping back centuries where every meal was more than just food. It was a testament to survival, resilience, and longing. Before we dive deeper, I'd love to know, where are you listening from right now? What hour holds your world? Share with me in the comments below. There's a special kind of magic in knowing how far our night owl community stretches across time zones and landscapes. If you find solace in weaving yourself into the rich fabric of history to soothe your soul and quiet your mind, consider subscribing. Together, we can wander these stories that remind us of our shared humanity. Now, picture a rough wooden table, scratched and worn by generations, bearing a simple meal, a bowl of thin, pale porridge, its blandness a quiet echo of hunger, a dense, coarse chunk of bread, heavy and unforgiving to the teeth, and if fortune smiles, a few tough, stringy morsels of meat chewed carefully to extract every last ounce of sustenance. This was the daily reality for most souls in medieval Europe. While distant castle halls overflowed with multi-course feasts fit for kings and nobles, the humble peasant faced a starkly different world. Their plates held monotony and scarcity. Their stomachs knew the ache of emptiness all too well. What cruel threads wove this tapestry of deprivation? Why did the majority endure such unappetizing fare? Let us explore the somber truth behind their daily bread. Inside a peasant's modest home, the rich aromas of faraway spices, the cinnamon, the nutmeg, the fiery pepper, were but distant dreams. These treasures were coveted luxuries, carried at great peril across daunting trade routes by brave merchants, meant only for the privileged elite. Imagine the arduous journey of a spice trader, braving deserts, mountains, and bandits along the Silk Road, carrying with them the promise of rare flavor and wealth. And yet, in the 11th century, the price of just 1 pound of nutmeg could equal 7 fattened oxen, a fortune beyond the reach of ordinary folk. Denied these vibrant tastes, peasants turned to what they could find: garlic's sharp bite, mustard's sting, and the sour tang of vinegar, to awaken their bland, repetitive meals. Fresh fruits and vegetables, when available at all, were fleeting gifts of the seasons, spoiled quickly without modern preservation. Only the luckiest had the chance to tend a small patch of hardy crops, onions, leeks, cabbages, that barely added color or life to their plates. Their sustenance rested heavily on grains: barley, rye, wheat, ground into coarse bread and watery porridge, supplemented by humble peas and beans. Though these meals filled empty bellies, they often failed to nourish fully. Malnutrition was a shadow that dulled childhood growth and sapped adult strength. Meat, that prized symbol of abundance and celebration, was a rare treasure. A peasant family might care for a pig, some chickens, or a lone cow, but these animals were more than food. They were precious investments, a promise for future survival. Slaughter was reserved for holy days, weddings, or when an animal's usefulness had faded. When meat was on the table, no part went wasted, from the organ meats to the smallest scraps. Sometimes small birds or caught in traps filled the gap. Though hunting was fraught with danger, punishable by harsh penalties if caught in royal forests. This stark, relentless existence, filled with longing, hardship, and the faintest glimmers of hope, invites us to remember that behind every simple meal was a story of endurance and quiet courage. Fish was more accessible than meat for those who lived near rivers or the sea, but it too was often preserved by drying, smoking, or salting to last through lean times. The result was a far cry from the delicate flaky fillets we enjoy today. Herring, cod, and eel were among the most common catches, and they would be packed in barrels with generous amounts of salt to stave off spoilage. There is a poignant reality in imagining those days when fresh food was a luxury many could barely grasp. Fish, more available than meat for riverside or coastal dwellers, was far from the tender, flaky fillets we savor now. Instead, it was heavily salted, smoked, or dried, transforming it into a tough, salty sustenance that bore little resemblance to the freshness we take for granted. Herring, cod, and eel, these humble fish, were heaped into barrels, buried deep in salt, in a desperate attempt to keep them from spoiling during harsh times. Freshwater fish like carp and pike were a delicacy reserved for the nobility who maintained private fish ponds on their estates. The scarcity of fresh food meant that medieval cooks had to get creative with preservation methods. Pickling, fermentation, and drying were all common techniques to extend the shelf life of perishables. Even freshwater fish, such as carp and pike, were privileges of the wealthy, kept in secluded ponds hidden within grand estates. The scarcity of fresh ingredients forced medieval cooks into inventive preservation techniques, pickling, fermenting, drying, all ways to stretch the life of food that was so precious yet so vulnerable to spoilage. One can almost feel the weight of survival pressing down on each meal, creativity born not from choice but necessity. Cabbage would be shredded and fermented into sauerkraut, cucumbers and onions, pickled in vinegar, and fruits like apples and pears dried for winter storage. These preserved foods added some much-needed variety to the peasant diet, but they were a far cry from the vibrant flavors of fresh produce. Shredded cabbage transformed into tangy sauerkraut, cucumbers and onions steeped in sharp vinegar, and fruits like apples and pears dried to endure the cold months. These were the rare sparks of variety in a peasant's limited diet. Yet, even these preserved foods could never replicate the lively, vibrant taste of fresh vegetables and fruits. Their flavors were muted echoes of what once was, underscoring the relentless hardship of a life lived on survival's edge. Even staples like bread and ale, which formed the foundation of medieval sustenance, were not always trustworthy. Unscrupulous bakers might stretch their dough with fillers like ground acorns, chalk, or even sawdust, leading to loaves that were as hard as rocks and about as nutritious. Ale, too, was often watered down to increase profits, a practice that earned some alewives a nasty reputation. In a time when clean drinking water was scarce, weak ale was often the only safe choice. The very basics, bread and ale, that sustained medieval lives were often fraught with deception. Bakers, driven by desperation or greed, adulterated their dough with ground acorns, chalk, or sawdust, baking loaves as hard as stones and nearly devoid of nourishment. Ale, diluted and weakened for extra profit, earned those who brewed it a reputation that echoed through villages. In an era when clean water was scarce and dangerous, even weak ale became a lifeline, a bitter necessity born of necessity itself. As the brewing process helped to kill off harmful bacteria, this brings us to perhaps the most unappetizing aspect of medieval dining: the utter lack of hygiene. Without an understanding of germs and food safety, contamination was rampant. Livestock were often kept close to living quarters for warmth and protection. The brewing process might have spared drinkers from some dangers, but it only highlights a darker truth. Medieval dining was shadowed by a profound lack of hygiene. Without knowledge of germs or sanitation, contamination was rampant. Animals were often kept near homes for warmth and protection, their waste seeping into the very spaces where food was prepared and consumed. Their waste seeped into the same areas where food was prepared and consumed. In crowded cities, garbage and human excrement filled the streets, tainting water sources and attracting vermin. It's no wonder that foodborne illnesses were common, with even royalty not immune to the dangers of spoiled fare. King John of England, for example, is said to have died after overindulging in peaches and new cider, a feast that likely led to a fatal case of dysentery. The filth was everywhere, waste mixing into food preparation spaces, streets choked with garbage and human excrement. Water sources were tainted, vermin thrived, and illness spread unchecked. It's no surprise that foodborne disease was common, and even the highest born were vulnerable. King John of England's tragic death, allegedly from overindulgence in peaches and fresh cider, likely stemmed from dysentery, a grim reminder that no one was truly safe from the hazards of their time. The specter of disease was never far from the medieval dinner table. The Black Death, which wiped out a third of Europe's population in the 14th century, spread in part due to unsanitary conditions that allowed rats and fleas to thrive. Food markets were particularly notorious as breeding grounds for pestilence, with flies buzzing around meat stalls and rodents scurrying underfoot. Disease lurked ominously beside every medieval meal. The Black Death, which claimed a third of Europe's population in the 14th century, found fertile ground in the filth, unsanitary conditions that allowed rats and fleas to multiply unchecked. Food markets, teeming with flies and scurrying rodents, became notorious hotspots of death and despair. It was a time when survival was a fragile thread, easily severed by the unseen enemies of a cruel, unclean world. It's a wonder that anyone survived the dangers of medieval dining at all. Yet, even in the face of scarcity and disease, there were glimmers of hope for better food. Monasteries and abbeys often served as havens of relative plenty, with well-tended gardens and orchards providing a bounty of fresh produce. Monks were known for their culinary skills, with some even writing cookbooks that offered a glimpse into the more refined cuisine of the upper classes. Of course, this food was not shared freely with the masses, but some monasteries did offer alms to the poor as a form of charity. For the nobility, feasts were an opportunity to showcase their wealth and power. A royal banquet might feature dozens of dishes, from roast swan and peacock to delicate pasties and sweet meats. Spices flowed freely, as did wine and ale, creating an atmosphere of gluttonous revelry. But even these lavish spreads were not without their dangers. Food poisoning was a common occurrence, with spoiled meats and rancid sauces taking their toll on noble stomachs, and the sheer volume of food consumed could lead to painful digestive issues. A reminder that even the privileged were not immune to the hazards of medieval dining. As we reflect on the harsh realities of food in the Middle Ages, it's hard not to feel a sense of gratitude for the abundance and variety that we enjoy today. Our supermarkets brim with fresh produce from around the globe. Our meats are safe and sanitized, and our spice racks hold flavors that would have been the envy of any medieval monarch. Yet, even as we savor the fruits of modernity, we can't help but marvel at the resilience and ingenuity of our ancestors, who made do with so little and found ways to survive in the face of unrelenting hardship. So, the next time you sit down to a meal, take a moment to appreciate the bounty before you. Savor the flavors and textures that medieval peasants could only dream of, and raise a glass to the countless generations who toiled and struggled to bring us to this point. And if you find yourself grumbling about a less than perfect dish, spare a thought for the medieval diner for whom even a simple bowl of porridge was a hard-won blessing. As we let our minds drift back to that distant past, let us take comfort in the knowledge that we are the fortunate inheritors of centuries of culinary progress. And let us not forget the lessons that history has to teach us, lessons of perseverance, creativity, and the enduring power of the human spirit to find sustenance and joy even in the darkest of times. And so, dear listener, I bid you good night and sweet dreams of a world where food is not just a necessity, but a source of endless delight. May your own culinary journey be filled with flavor, nourishment, and the warm glow of gratitude for all that we have been given. Until next time, rest well and dream of feasts yet to come. Part 4. Adulterated food and drink. In the dimly lit streets of a medieval city, a baker glances furtively to the left and right before slipping quietly back into his shadowed shop. There, with trembling hands, he pulls out a coarse sack of sawdust and begins kneading it into the dough, desperately stretching his meager supply of precious flour. For many bakers like him, this small deception was not born of greed, but sheer necessity, the fragile thread keeping their families from hunger. Bread was more than just food. It was the very lifeblood sustaining the medieval world. Yet its purity was fragile, often shattered by the harsh realities of scarcity. Unscrupulous bakers, pressed by relentless poverty, resort to adding fillers, ground acorns, chalk, sawdust, each handful diluting what should have been nourishment into a coarse, gritty loaf that barely fed the body, let alone the spirit. The staple that once fueled tireless peasants through backbreaking labor had itself become a bitter hardship, a reminder of the endless struggle to survive. Not only bread, but ale and wine bore the scars of desperation. Ale, wives, and innkeepers, caught between the need to feed their own families and the harsh demands of commerce, watered down their brews until the rich, hearty ales that once marked the pride of the British Isles were reduced to thin, sour swill. In a dim corner, Elizabeth, one such alewife, stirs her bubbling cauldron with weary hands, adding yet another bucket of cloudy water. Her children linger nearby, their hungry eyes fixated on every drip, each one a fragile hope that this watered batch will carry them through another day. As Elizabeth ladles out a mug of the diluted ale, a deep sigh escapes her lips. A silent mourning for the rich, full-bodied brews her grandmother once crafted, a family legacy now lost beneath the weight of necessity. In a time when clean water was a rare treasure, this adulterated ale and wine became grim necessities. Wells and rivers, tainted by human and animal waste, were rife with disease, forcing peasants to make an impossible choice: drink from poisoned water or swallow the empty, thin calories of watered-down ale. Authorities did attempt to fight back. The Assize of Bread and Ale, a law passed in the 13th century, sought to regulate price, weight, and quality with harsh penalties for those who cheated. But with scarce resources and overwhelming poverty, enforcement was weak, and food adulteration persisted like a shadow over the poor. Thus, the lives of medieval peasants became a constant dance of compromise, caught between the gnawing ache of hunger and the bitter sting of disappointment in every adulterated bite. Each mouthful was a stark reminder of their fragile existence, where even the simplest sustenance could not be taken for granted. As we peer deeper into the harsh realities of medieval food, let us remember these were not mere facts of history, but the lived, raw struggles of real people, mothers, fathers, children, fighting every day to stay alive. And as our journey continues, we will see how the very places they called home, cramped, unsanitary, shared with beasts, turned the simple act of eating into a dangerous challenge. Picture, if you will, a small thatched cottage huddled against the chill of a medieval winter. Inside, a family gathers close around a meager fire, their breaths mingling with the rising steam from a bubbling pot of pottage. The flickering light casts long shadows on the worn walls, while in the corner a pig roots through the rushes on the dirt floor. It snorts and grunts, an ever-present sound woven into the fabric of the family's daily existence. This was the harsh reality for many medieval peasants, a life lived in cramped quarters alongside their animals, bound together by necessity and survival. Animals were kept inside the home, not out of affection, but for warmth and protection from the biting cold. Their dung and debris mixed with the straw and rushes that served as the only floor covering, creating a grim environment where disease silently thrived. Fleas and lice bred freely in the filth, invisible enemies that gnawed at bodies already weakened by hardship. Even in the grandest castles where feasts of unimaginable abundance were laid out, sanitation remained a fragile concept. Without a clear understanding of hygiene, even the most lavish celebrations could turn deadly. The tragic story of King John of England stands as a stark reminder. In 1216, while journeying across his kingdom, the king indulged in an excess of peaches, likely spoiled fruit, that led to a fatal bout of dysentery. His death was not just the fall of a monarch, but a poignant symbol of how perilous medieval life truly was, no matter one's status. In the crowded, winding streets of medieval cities, the situation was even more harrowing. Narrow alleys were clogged with garbage and human waste, poisoning the air and leaching into the water supply. The Thames in London was both a source of drinking water and a dumping ground for filth. It was a cruel cycle. People consumed the same water that carried disease, condemning themselves unknowingly. Diseases such as dysentery, typhoid, and most terrifyingly, the Black Death ravaged the population. The plague spread with terrifying speed, carried by fleas that thrived on rats inhabiting the squalid streets. Death lurked in every corner, indiscriminate and merciless. For the average peasant, escape was nearly impossible. They lived and died amid the muck, their bodies weakened not only by hunger and malnutrition, but also by the relentless assault of disease. Even the simple act of eating, a basic human need, became a precarious gamble, each bite a risk that could end in sickness or death. As we reflect on this grim reality, it is easy to feel overwhelming despair for those trapped in such brutal conditions. Yet, amid this darkness, faint rays of hope pierced through. Neighbors sharing their scant resources, quiet acts of kindness, and the solace found in faith and community. The church, despite its complex and sometimes burdensome role, provided a fragile thread of relief and hope for many. The tolling of church bells marked the rhythm of medieval life. For peasants toiling endlessly in the fields, these bells were more than a call to prayer. They were a momentary reprieve from the crushing weight of hunger and labor. In a world where so much was uncertain and harsh, the church stood as a bastion of stability and authority, offering both comfort and control. But this authority came with its own set of rules and restrictions, many of which centered around food. The Catholic Church mandated frequent fasting and meatless days, particularly during the penitential season of Lent. For 40 days before Easter, the faithful were expected to abstain from meat, dairy, and eggs, a tall order for those already struggling to put food on the table. The story of one peasant family illustrates the hardship these fasts could impose. John and his wife Margaret toiled from sunup to sundown on their small plot of land, barely growing enough to feed their 3 children. When Lent arrived, they faced a daunting choice: honor the fast and risk weakening their already malnourished bodies, or defy the church and face the consequences for their immortal souls. In the end, they chose to follow the fast, subsisting on meager portions of bread, pottage, and the occasional dried fish. By Easter, their faces were gaunt and their steps heavy with exhaustion, yet they took solace in the belief that their suffering would be rewarded in the next life. Despite the additional hardships these fasts imposed, the church was not entirely deaf to the plight of the poor. Monasteries and abbeys often served as a source of food aid, distributing bread and alms to the needy as a form of Christian charity. The monks, with their vast lands and resources, were able to provide a measure of relief to the hungry masses. Yet even this charity had its limits. When crops failed and famine struck, the demand for aid often outstripped the church's ability to provide. And for those caught poaching in the royal forests, a desperate attempt to supplement their meager diets with fresh game, the church's mercy was noticeably absent. Poachers, if caught, faced severe punishments from maiming to death, regardless of their circumstances. And so, the church's influence on medieval food was a double-edged sword. It provided solace and aid to some while imposing additional burdens on others. For the peasant family, faith was both a source of strength and a further trial to endure in the face of unrelenting hunger. As we turn our gaze to the final chapter of our journey through medieval food, we will witness a scene of shocking contrast, the opulent feast of a noble household. Behind these austere rules lay a world of struggle and sacrifice, where faith intertwined with survival in a fragile balance. For John and Margaret, every day was a battle not just against the land's unforgiving soil, but against the gnawing emptiness inside their bellies. Their bodies, already worn thin by poverty, were pushed to the edge by the church's demands. The hunger was relentless, a dull ache that settled deep within their bones, sapping energy and hope alike. Yet their hearts clung fiercely to the promise of spiritual reward, a beacon flickering through the bleakness. Each bite of dry bread, each sip of watery pottage was a silent prayer, an offering made in faith and desperation. The toll was visible in their hollow eyes and the stooped weariness of their frames, but the strength of their devotion shone through, fragile yet unyielding. Meanwhile, the church's charity was a bittersweet lifeline, offering crumb-sized relief in the face of widespread famine and suffering. The generosity of the monks, though real, could not fill every empty stomach, nor soften every harsh punishment meted out to those forced into theft and poaching. The harshness of the laws cast a long shadow, revealing the stark divide between compassion and control. This was a world where faith was both sanctuary and shackle, where the sacred and the sorrowful lived side by side. In the hunger and hardship of this peasant family, we glimpse the resilience of the human spirit and the complex, often painful role that belief played in their lives. Soon, our story will take us beyond this humble reality into the dazzling excess of noble banquets, where abundance and deprivation collided in the most dramatic of contrasts. Against the harsh reality of peasant hardship, these extravagant medieval feasts stand out like a blazing contrast, a vivid emblem of the staggering inequalities that shaped that era. The disparity is not just about food, it's a mirror reflecting the divides in power, wealth, and fate. Part 7, the rare medieval feast. Imagine the great hall of a castle bathed in the gentle flicker of 100 candles. Their flames dance softly, casting shadows on ancient tapestries that line the walls. Each thread a vibrant storyteller weaving tales of valor, romance, and noble legacy. The atmosphere is thick with history and grandeur. At the head of this magnificent room, raised on a dais, the lord and lady sit as sovereigns of abundance. Their presence commands the space, surrounded by an opulence that few could ever dream to touch. The massive oak table stretching before them groans under the sheer weight of countless dishes. Whole roasted pigs, their skins crackling golden with perfection, jostle for room alongside silver platters bearing delicately spiced peacock, a symbol of extravagance itself. Baskets overflow with fresh Maine bread, soft and white like clouds that seem almost too perfect to eat. The air is perfumed with the intoxicating scents of saffron, cinnamon, and cloves, spices so precious they are worth their weight in gold, whispered treasures from distant lands. Each breath taken here is a feast for the senses. In the bustling castle kitchens, the master cook commands a frenetic symphony of culinary artistry. His sharp orders cut through the clatter as his assistants hurriedly baste meats, stir bubbling pots, and craft sugar sculptures shaped into whimsical castles and mythical unicorns. For him, this feast is more than a meal. It is his masterpiece, a moment to etch his name in the annals of favor and prestige. As the feast unfolds, the diners abandon restraint. They gorge themselves on a seemingly endless parade of dishes, tearing into tender roast venison, savoring creamy almond soup, and indulging in blanc manger, a delicate dish of shredded chicken mingled with rice, milk, and sugar. Goblets brim with richly spiced wine and frothy ale, the liquid warmth fueling the revelry. Yet beneath the dazzling surface, subtle reminders of medieval fragility emerge. A noblewoman, cheeks flushed from wine and indulgence, suddenly pales, excusing herself quietly, the richness of the feast too much for her stomach to bear. A knight, his teeth stained and rotting from sugary excess, bites into a tough piece of meat and winces, pain flashing across his face. This feast, grand and lush, carries with it the shadows of a world where privilege and suffering live side by side. Behind every sumptuous bite lies a story of scarcity, toil, and the tenuous thread by which life was held. The medieval feast is not just a display of abundance. It is a complex dance of power, survival, and the fleeting pleasures that momentarily mask the deep inequalities of the age. Hovering quietly at the edges of the grand hall, the serving staff watch the indulgent excesses of their masters, with eyes heavy with both envy and a simmering resentment. In their hearts, they know the harsh truth, that come tomorrow, the lavish feast will be nothing but a fading memory, replaced once more by the relentless routine of coarse bread and thin, watery gruel. This fleeting night of abundance serves only to deepen the cruel divide between their humble existence and the world of those who dine above them. As the last ornate plates are carried away and the final crumbs swept from the table, we are left alone with the haunting contrasts of medieval life. For the nobility, feasts were more than meals. They were grand displays of wealth, power, and status, an opportunity to celebrate the finest delicacies the land could offer. But for the vast majority, food was a daily battle against hunger, scarcity, spoiled provisions, and disease lurking within every bite. In our modern era of plenty, where the bounty of markets is taken for granted and choices are endless, it is easy to forget the relentless struggles of our medieval ancestors. Yet, by remembering their hardships, by feeling the weight of their hunger and the uncertainty of their tables, we come to appreciate the ease and richness we enjoy today all the more deeply. As we sit down to our own meals, let us not only savor the flavors dancing on our tongues, but also hold in our hearts the hard-fought progress and resilience that have paved the way for such abundance. This is more than nourishment. It is a testament to human endurance and hope. So, as we close this chapter on the story of medieval food, let us do so with gratitude and humility. In the vast tapestry of human history, our present moment is but a brief, privileged thread woven through the countless lives and shared meals that came before us. Each morsel, each feast and famine, speaks to the unyielding spirit of humanity. Our journey through the world of medieval sustenance has revealed a landscape marked by scarcity and inequality. From the dull monotony of peasant pottage to the dangerous deceptions of adulterated bread, the daily act of eating was fraught with hardship. The limited spices, the struggle to preserve food, the imbalanced diets and unsanitary conditions all made nourishment a fragile victory. We saw how the church's strict fasting rules layered spiritual burdens upon physical suffering, while the nobility's glittering banquets stood in stark, painful contrast. Yet amid these hardships, glimmers of humanity shine through. The creativity of cooks coaxing flavor from meager ingredients, the bonds of community forged over shared scraps, and the comfort drawn from rituals of faith and feast. In these moments, the resilience of the human spirit becomes undeniable. This story is not just about food, it is about survival, dignity, and the small acts of hope that nourish us all. In our modern world, it's easy to take for granted the abundance and variety of our food. We can walk into a supermarket and find fruits from South America, spices from Asia, and cheeses from Europe, all neatly packaged and ready to eat. We can dine in restaurants serving cuisines from around the globe, or have a world of flavors delivered right to our doorstep. But pause for a moment and try to truly feel what that means. Imagine transporting a medieval peasant whose daily existence was shadowed by hunger and scarcity into the dazzling aisle of a modern grocery store. The sheer variety would overwhelm them, the brilliant reds, greens, and yellows of fresh produce glowing under bright lights, the hum of refrigerated cases stocked with milk and eggs, a luxury beyond their wildest dreams. The endless rows of packaged meals and snacks, promises of ease and flavor waiting to be unwrapped. For someone whose meals were often meager and repetitive, it would be like stepping into a fairy tale, a surreal land overflowing with unimaginable plenty. Yet, even as we marvel at our culinary riches, we are not without our own battles. Beneath this bounty lies the heavy toll on our environment, the stark inequalities in who can access this food, and the health struggles that come with overindulgence. In our relentless pursuit of convenience and endless choice, we sometimes lose sight of what truly nourishes us, the simple seasonal foods grown close to home, the slow, loving preparation of meals shared with others. Perhaps the hardships of our medieval ancestors hold lessons for us still. Their lives remind us to cherish the earth's gifts and to approach food with reverence rather than entitlement. Each meal on our plates is not just nourishment, it's the culmination of a remarkable journey, from sun-drenched fields tended with care and perseverance, to bustling kitchens alive with creativity and tradition, to the warmth of our own tables where stories and laughter mingle with every bite. This journey reflects the resilience and spirit of humanity itself. So, as we close this reflection on the history of medieval food, let us raise a glass, or perhaps a humble wooden cup, in honor of the countless generations before us. Through their struggles with hunger and hope, deprivation and celebration, they forged the foundation upon which our world's abundance now stands. By honoring their legacy, we gain wisdom and perspective to build a future where every person can eat with joy, dignity, and enough. While the royal cook busied himself preparing extravagant feasts in grand castle kitchens, most of his fellow countrymen endured meals of stark simplicity. For the peasants laboring in the fields, a meal was often little more than coarse bread and pottage, a thin stew made from whatever vegetables or scraps were at hand. On rare, fortunate days, salted pork or dried fish might lend flavor to the watery gruel. But more often, the meal was bland and barely filling, leaving their stomachs aching with hunger, yet their spirits quietly enduring. This contrast, the vast gulf between plenty and want, speaks to the resilience of the human heart. It invites us not only to appreciate the abundance we enjoy, but also to cultivate compassion and responsibility for those still facing scarcity. May we never forget that behind every plate lies a story of survival, hope, and the timeless human quest for nourishment in all its forms. The life of a medieval peasant was a relentless struggle, marked by an ever-present shadow of hardship and deprivation. Nowhere was this more painfully evident than in the simple act of securing their next meal. While nobles reveled in extravagant feasts, their tables adorned with exotic dishes spiced with treasures from distant lands, the peasants faced a starkly different reality. Their diet was not only meager, but also unbearably monotonous, a daily reminder of their place in a harsh social order. Yet, the dangers of food were not confined to the poor. Even the aristocracy, with all their wealth and privilege, could not escape the hidden perils that medieval food held. Without refrigeration or modern preservation methods, spoilage was a constant threat. The sumptuous banquets meant to celebrate power and status sometimes turned fatal. This cruel irony was embodied in the tragic tale of King John of England, whose reign ended abruptly in 1216, allegedly due to a surfeit of peaches. As he journeyed through King's Lynn, a severe bout of dysentery seized him. Some blamed the rich abbey fare, others the very peaches he had eaten with with relish. Whatever the cause, the powerful monarch's death from something as humble as fruit underscores the precariousness of life in those times. For the common folk, the dangers were far graver. Hunger was a constant companion, gnawing relentlessly at their bodies and spirits. When famine struck and crops failed, desperation forced people to consume whatever they could find. Acorns, coarse grass, even plants rarely considered food, ground into rough flour to eke out bread. Sometimes, they resorted to consuming animals that had perished from disease, gambling with their lives for a morsel of sustenance. Every meal was a silent battle against death itself. Even in more stable times, the food was far from safe. Unscrupulous bakers adulterated bread with fillers like sawdust and chalk to stretch their limited resources, and brewers diluted their ale to increase profits, betraying the trust of those who depended on them. Such deceptions were not mere economic cheats, they were threats to survival. Illness and death from tainted food and drink were grim realities that communities faced silently. In village taverns, the alewife was a figure both essential and vulnerable. Her craft, brewing ale, was a lifeline for many, but also a source of suspicion. If her ale tasted weak or soured too quickly, whispers of adulteration or even witchcraft could follow. In an age ruled by superstition and fear, the boundary between a harmless bad batch and deadly poison was perilously thin. This glimpse into medieval food life reveals not just the physical hardships, but also the emotional weight. The constant fear, the struggle for dignity amidst deprivation, the thin line between survival and surrender. It makes us appreciate the abundance and safety of food today, while reminding us of the resilience and courage of those who lived before us, for whom every meal was a fragile hope against the odds. Despite the many challenges and hardships that medieval people faced in their daily lives, they were not without their small joys and comforts. For the peasant family gathered around the hearth at the end of a long day, a simple meal of bread and pottage could be a moment of respite and togetherness. And for the monks and nuns who dedicated their lives to prayer and service, the austere diet prescribed by their religious orders could be a source of spiritual nourishment and discipline. But even in the monasteries and abbeys that dotted the medieval landscape, food was not always a source of comfort or sustenance. During the holy season of Lent, when Christians were expected to fast and abstain from meat, the already limited diets of the religious orders would be further restricted. For 40 long days, they would subsist on little more than bread, water, and the occasional vegetable or fish. For some, this period of deprivation was a welcome opportunity to focus on their spiritual lives and to draw closer to God. Yet for others, it was a time of great hardship and temptation, as the pangs of hunger gnawed at their resolve and tested their faith. In a world where food was so often scarce and unpredictable, the idea of voluntarily giving it up must have seemed the height of insanity. And yet, despite all the hardships and challenges medieval people faced daily, they found ways to adapt and persevere. They learned to preserve their food through salting, smoking, and drying, to make the most of the meager ingredients available to them, and to find joy and comfort in the simple pleasures of life. In many ways, the story of medieval food is a story of resilience and ingenuity in the face of adversity. It reminds us how far we have come in terms of food safety, variety, and abundance, but also how much we still share in common with our ancestors. For just as they struggled to put food on the table and nourish their families, so too do we grapple with the challenges of our own time. From climate change and food insecurity to the pressures of modern life, as we sit down to our own meals, laden with a dizzying array of flavors and ingredients from all corners of the globe, it is easy to forget the hardships and sacrifices that have brought us to this point. But by understanding the history of our food and the ways in which it has shaped our culture and our identity, we can gain a greater appreciation for the abundance and diversity that we enjoy today. In the quiet moments before we savor each bite, there lies a story, a long, winding journey marked by struggle, resilience, and hope. As we reflect on the flavors that dance on our tongues, we must remember the countless hands, farmers, cooks, laborers, who across generations have toiled relentlessly to put food on our tables. Their sacrifices have woven a legacy of creativity and strength, reminding us that every meal is more than nourishment. It is a testament to human endurance through even the darkest times. So the next time you bite into a juicy apple or savor a slice of warm, crusty bread, take a moment to reflect on the long and winding road that has brought us to this point. Give thanks for the countless generations of farmers, cooks, and laborers who have toiled to put food on our tables and who have left us a legacy of resilience, creativity, and hope in the face of even the greatest challenges. Perhaps if a medieval peasant were somehow transported to a modern grocery store, they would be overwhelmed by the sheer abundance and variety of food available. They might marvel at the exotic fruits and vegetables from far-off lands, the gleaming displays of meat and fish, and the aisles upon aisles of packaged and processed foods. Yet, beneath this dazzling spectacle, they might feel a quiet unease. Questions would stir in their minds about the hidden costs and compromises behind this abundance. How is our food grown? What additives and preservatives keep it fresh and appealing? What toll does this bounty take on our health, our environment, and the communities that nurture it? In the end, the medieval peasant might simply shake their head in wonder and return to their own time, content with the simple fare that has sustained them for generations. For while our modern food system may offer us greater choice and convenience than ever before, it is not without its own challenges and drawbacks. This reflection invites us to embrace gratitude, awareness, and responsibility, to honor the past even as we navigate the complexities of the present, striving toward a future where the food on our tables nourishes not just our bodies, but our shared humanity. And just as the medieval peasant had to learn to make do with what they had, to find joy and sustenance in the face of scarcity and hardship, so too must we learn to navigate the complexities of our own food landscape. We must learn to make choices that nourish not only our bodies, but also our souls, that honor the sacrifices and struggles of those who came before us, and that leave a legacy of health and abundance for generations to come. So let us raise a toast to the humble peasant, the hardworking farmer, the skilled artisan, and all those who have labored to put food on our tables throughout history. Let us savor the flavors and textures of the foods we eat, not just as a source of sustenance, but as a connection to the past and a promise for the future. And let us never forget the power of food to bring us together, to nourish our bodies and our spirits, and to remind us of our shared humanity in the face of even the greatest challenges. As we've seen, the medieval spice trade was a lucrative but perilous business. Those who controlled the flow of spices could amass great fortunes, while those who toiled to bring these precious commodities to Europe risked life and limb. One such spice merchant was a man named Giovanni de Marignoli. Born in the early 14th century to a noble Florentine family, Giovanni seemed destined for a life of ease and comfort. But a restless spirit and a thirst for adventure led him down a different path. In 1338, Giovanni set out on a journey that would take him across the known world, from the bustling ports of Italy to the distant lands of China and India. As a papal envoy and missionary, his official purpose was to spread the Christian faith. But Giovanni was also a keen businessman, always on the lookout for valuable spices and other exotic goods to bring back to Europe. Giovanni's travels were fraught with danger at every turn. He crossed the vast deserts of Central Asia, braving sandstorms and bandits. He navigated treacherous mountain passes in the Himalayas, battling altitude sickness and frostbite. He sailed the storm-tossed seas of the Indian Ocean, praying to survive each monsoon season. But for all the hardships he endured, Giovanni was also enchanted by the wonders he encountered. He marveled at the gleaming white palaces of Khan Balik, the Mongol capital later known as Beijing. He admired the pious devotion of the Thomas Christians in southern India. He reveled in the heady scents and flavors of the spice markets in Sun and Malabar. Along the way, Giovanni gathered a precious cargo of cinnamon, pepper, cloves, and nutmeg, each spice carefully packed in sturdy chests to shield them from the dampness that threatened to ruin them on the long voyage home. He knew that if he could bring these exotic treasures safely back to Italy, he stood to claim a fortune that could change his life forever. But fate was cruel to Giovanni. Some stories whisper that his ship vanished beneath the waves during the return journey, swallowing him and his priceless spices into the cold, unyielding sea. Others tell a darker tale, that he survived the crossing only to fall victim to ruthless brigands near Florence, who robbed him of his precious cargo and left his dreams scattered to the winds. Whatever the truth may be, Giovanni de Marinoli's tale stands as a haunting testament to the perilous allure of the medieval spice trade. For a few bold merchants and fortunate adventurers, spices were a golden ticket to unimaginable wealth. For most, however, like Giovanni, they remained an elusive dream, forever just beyond reach. As we drift off to sleep, let us imagine ourselves wandering through a bustling spice market in some distant corner of the medieval world. The air is thick with the intoxicating scents of pepper and cinnamon, cardamom and saffron. Merchants shout and haggle in a dozen different tongues, their voices rising and falling like the restless tide. We stroll through narrow alleys, baskets in hand, marveling at colorful mounds of spices brought from every far-flung corner of the globe. Here, a pile of knotted ginger root, sharp and pungent. There, heaps of cloves, like tiny brown nails, their warm, sweet aroma beckoning. But as we fill our baskets with these treasures, a quiet pang of regret stirs for those who will never taste such flavors. For the poor peasants back home, a mere pinch of pepper would be an unimaginable luxury, let alone the fragrant curry or spiced wine of distant lands. Their meals, as we will explore further, were a monotonous blend of gruel and grit, a stark contrast to the sumptuous feasts enjoyed by the wealthy. Yet even those grand banquets, as we will soon uncover, could conceal their own grim dangers and unpleasant surprises. So let us savor this imagined abundance, this fleeting sensory delight, as we sink deeper into dreams. For when dawn breaks, we must once again face the harsh realities of medieval food, a daily battle to fill the belly that united prince and peasant alike. The scarcity and hardship that marked the food of the masses stretched even to the very staples that formed the foundation of their diets. Bread, the simplest and most universal of foods, was a far cry from the soft, fragrant loaves we cherish today. For the poorer peasants, bread was a dense, coarse creation, dark and heavy, made from lower quality grains like barley, rye, or even beans and chestnuts when times were especially hard. These loaves were tough to digest and offered little nourishment, a constant reminder of scarcity. The bread was often gritty, filled with impurities from crude milling methods, and it spoiled quickly in the damp, chilly homes of peasants. Even those who could afford wheat ate bread that lacked the airy lightness of modern loaves. Yeast and other leavening agents were luxuries, rare and costly, so most bread was unleavened flat bread, baked on stones or sun-dried. The result was a hard, cracker-like staple that was as much about survival as sustenance. Bread was more than food. It was a symbol of social status. The finest, whitest loaves, crafted from pure wheat flour, were reserved strictly for the nobility, while the peasants' coarse, grayish-brown black bread was looked down upon. In some places, laws forbade commoners from eating white bread, making it a bitter marker of inequality baked into every meal. Among the figures who left a lasting imprint on medieval bread and nutrition was Saint Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century mystic and abbess born into nobility in what is now Germany. Beyond her spiritual visions and music, Hildegard was a pioneering herbalist and healer. Her deep knowledge of natural medicine shines through in her writings, where she emphasized the vital importance of wholesome grains and proper nourishment, a revolutionary idea in a time when hunger and poor diet were the norm. In her treatise Physica, she praised spelt, an ancient grain akin to wheat, as the finest grain for human consumption. She believed that spelt bread could nourish the body and prolong life. At the same time, she warned against eating raw cereals, which she considered harmful to health. Her insights remind us that even in an era shadowed by deprivation, wisdom about food and healing persisted, a light of hope amid hardship. Hildegard put her knowledge into practice, overseeing the extensive agricultural lands and bakery of her abbey. Under her guidance, the nuns of Bingen produced high-quality spelt bread that was distributed to the sick and poor in the surrounding community. Though spelt was still a luxury commodity out of reach for most peasants, Hildegard's advocacy of it as a healthier alternative to common wheat was remarkably prescient. Modern nutritional science has vindicated many of her claims, showing spelt to be higher in protein and easier to digest for many people than highly processed modern wheat. The life and work of Hildegard of Bingen provide a glimpse into the crucial role that bread played in medieval society, not just as a staple food, but as a symbol of social status and a potential tool for healing. Her teachings, informed by a holistic understanding of the connection between food and health, foreshadowed modern ideas about nutrition and wellness. Despite the efforts of visionaries like Hildegard, bread for most people in the Middle Ages remained a coarse, bland staple that was often scarce. The unequal distribution of this basic necessity was just one more way in which the stark class divides of medieval society manifested in its food culture. For the poorest peasants, even the meager comfort of a regular supply of bread could be stripped away by the cruel twists of fate and weather. In times of drought, flood, or blight, when grain crops failed, the specter of famine loomed large over medieval communities. During these dreaded years of dearth, food prices would skyrocket while wages plummeted, leaving many peasants unable to afford even basic subsistence. With no social safety net to rely on, the poorest were left to starve or resort to desperate measures like eating bark, grass, or even cannibalism. In the most extreme cases, one of the worst famines to strike medieval Europe was the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322, a catastrophic confluence of factors, including climate change, crop failures, and the economic fallout of endless wars, plunged the continent into a 7-year period of starvation and misery. Chronicles of the time paint a grim picture of the suffering endured by the common people. Men ate dogs, horses, cats, and other uncleans, wrote the Flemish monk William of Nangus. Some men, it was said, compelled by hunger, ate the bodies of executed criminals, and some poor people even ate their own children. The famine hit the Low Countries in Scandinavia particularly hard, with mortality rates as high as 10 to 25% in some regions. In the German city of Erfurt, the famine years saw an average of 16 deaths per day, compared to just 2 per day in normal times. Even in the best of times, the threat of hunger was never far away from medieval peasants. Behind Hildegard's wise stewardship lay a world fraught with sharp contrasts, a beacon of hope amid widespread hardship. The gentle rhythm of the abbey's bakery, producing nourishing spelt bread, stood in stark opposition to the harsh reality faced by most peasants. For many, bread was not a nourishing symbol of healing, but a scarce, bitter reminder of their marginal existence. The relentless cruelty of nature and fate weighed heavily on the poorest. Each season brought anxiety. Would the rains come? Would the harvest fail? The specter of famine cast a shadow that chilled not just bodies but spirits. In these darkest times, desperation gnawed at the edges of humanity itself, forcing choices so unthinkable they haunt history. The Great Famine's horrors reach beyond statistics into the heartache of families torn apart, of children lost, of communities shattered. The haunting chronicles speak of a world stripped bare, where survival became an obsession, and where the fragile thread of civilization seemed perilously close to unraveling. Yet even amid this abyss, small lights endured, acts of kindness, the care of the abbey, the hope for a better harvest. The story of medieval bread is not only about hunger and deprivation, but also about resilience and the enduring human spirit clinging to life in the face of relentless adversity. Their precarious existence, always at the mercy of the unforgiving elements and the often capricious will of their lords, meant that food insecurity was a shadow that never left medieval peasants. The grim reality of famine loomed large, casting an oppressive veil over everyday life. It was a stark reminder of the fragile thread on which life hung in an age before the advent of modern agriculture, refrigeration, or social safety nets. In this world, even the simplest gift of bread could not be counted on. Each harvest was a gamble. One poor season away from starvation, entire communities could crumble. This ever-present threat of hunger shaped not only what people ate, but fundamentally how they saw the world. Hunger was not just a physical state, it was woven into the fabric of medieval existence, shaping hopes, fears, and faith. From our vantage point, awash in abundance and endless choices, it's hard to grasp just how precious a full belly was in those times. A stale crust was a treasure beyond measure. Every meal carried with it the weight of survival. And yet, even as bread stood as a symbol of sustenance, meat held an even more complex place in medieval life. For all but the wealthiest nobles, meat was a rarity, a luxury reserved for the grandest occasions, or the mercy of a successful hunt. When it did appear, it was often far from the tender, juicy cuts we expect today. Without refrigeration, preserving meat was a challenge of necessity and ingenuity. Salting was the most common method, but salt was a double-edged sword. Often of poor quality, riddled with impurities, it could leave the meat tasting foul or even cause illness. Smoking and drying were other techniques, giving birth to sausages and hams that could last through the long winters, but at a cost. Their texture toughened into something closer to leather than the succulent meat we crave. For peasants, meat usually meant the leftovers, tough, sinewy cuts from older animals past their prime for milk or work. Beef was a rarity for the common folk. Cattle were too valuable alive for labor or breeding to be slaughtered lightly. Pork and poultry appeared a little more frequently but remained prized luxuries. Regional and social differences shaped diets dramatically. In Slavic and Scandinavian lands, freshwater fish often substituted for scarce meat. Hunting was jealously guarded by the nobility, a privilege that underscored the social chasm. Venison and game were theirs alone. The glaring inequality of meat consumption in medieval times can be vividly seen in the records from King Richard II's kitchens in the late 14th century. For a single royal feast in 1387, the cooks prepared a staggering 2,000 chickens, 400 sheep, 500 stags, and 1,000 little pigs, an unimaginable banquet for most. Meanwhile, a peasant family might hope for meat only a handful of times a year, usually on major religious holidays like Christmas and Easter, moments when scarcity gave way briefly to celebration. This contrast is more than just a matter of food. It is a testament to a world divided by fortune and fate, where the abundance of a few existed alongside the hunger of many. It reminds us how deeply intertwined food was with power, survival, and social order in medieval life. Even then, the cuts of meat were scarce. Meager portions carefully hoarded for months, each bite a precious treasure. Yet, for a fleeting and extraordinary moment in the history of medieval England, the humble peasants were granted a rare glimpse into a world usually reserved for their lords and masters, a taste of abundance that had long eluded them. In the dark wake of the Black Death, which mercilessly claimed up to half the population in the mid-14th century, a profound shift quietly took root. The vast labor shortage transformed the very fabric of society, gifting the surviving peasants a newfound power they had never before known. With fewer mouths to feed and an abundance of untended land, these common folk found themselves in the remarkable position to demand higher wages and improved living conditions, a small but significant victory carved out of devastation. For a brief, golden few decades, the lives of England's commoners blossomed with promise. The grim monotony of their diets gave way to moments of indulgence. More peasants could now afford livestock for their own tables rather than simply tending animals for the market. Meat, once an unattainable luxury, began to make rare appearances on humble plates. Chicken, pig, even the occasional cow. Wages doubled, sometimes even tripled, fueling hopes that a better life was within reach. Yet this fragile dawn was swiftly overshadowed by the unease of the landed nobility. Threatened by the rising confidence and bargaining power of the peasants, the aristocracy struck back with laws designed to freeze wages and bind peasants to the land, tightening the chains of serfdom once more. This fierce clash would ignite the peasants' revolt of 1381, a desperate cry for justice that was brutally crushed, its leaders executed, and its hard-won gains rolled back. Still, that revolt stands as a powerful testament to the Black Death's transformative impact, a rare moment when the common people dared to glimpse a life less shackled by scarcity and toil. But for the vast majority of the Middle Ages and for most souls, meat remained a rare, coveted delicacy, a shimmering symbol of status and power, a constant reminder of the yawning divide between the privileged few and the struggling masses. In the great halls of castles and manor houses, nobles and knights reveled in feasts piled high with roasted game and tender fowl, washing down their bounty with fine wines and honeyed mead. Meanwhile, in the cramped hovels of peasants, a small scrap of salted pork or a lean chicken leg was a treasured prize, savored carefully, stretched thin to feed the family. This stark disparity in access to such a fundamental food underscores the brutal inequalities that shaped medieval life. In a world where simply having a full belly was a mark of privilege, The gulf between rich and poor was as vast as the distance between a king's glittering banquet and a peasant's empty trencher. As we have seen, that rare morsel of meat was a beacon of joy in the otherwise dull and meager diets endured by most. Yet even this small pleasure was tightly controlled by the powerful hand of the Church. The Catholic Church, wielding immense influence over every facet of daily existence, dictated the rhythms of eating through its calendar of fast days and meatless observances, times when even the sight or taste of animal flesh was forbidden, binding the faithful to spiritual discipline at the cost of earthly desire. In this intersection of faith, power, and survival, the simple act of eating became a deeply charged experience, one that revealed not just the physical hunger of a people, but the social and spiritual hunger woven into the fabric of medieval existence. The most significant of these was the season of Lent, the 40-day period leading up to Easter. During this time, all meat, dairy, and eggs were off limits, leaving the faithful to subsist on a meager diet of fish, vegetables, and bread. For wealthy nobles, this was a minor inconvenience. They could afford to import exotic fruits, nuts, and spices to liven up their Lenten fare. Their well-stocked fish ponds ensured a steady supply of fresh seafood. But for the poor, Lent meant an even more restricted and monotonous diet than usual. The Church's rationale for these dietary restrictions was rooted in the idea of penance and spiritual discipline. By denying themselves the pleasures of the flesh, even in the form of food, the faithful were thought to be purifying their souls and aligning themselves with the suffering of Christ. Yet in a world where hunger and scarcity were daily realities for most, this voluntary deprivation must have felt like a cruel irony. For peasants who rarely tasted meat anyway, the added restrictions deepened the monotony of their already meager meals. The Church's power was so immense that few dared openly defy its rules. To do so risked not just social ostracism, but the terrifying threat of eternal damnation. At a time when the afterlife was considered more real and urgent than earthly life, this fear was a powerful chain binding the faithful. One poignant story from a 14th century English manor reveals the harshness of Lenten fasting. In 1322, Agnes Paston, a peasant woman, was brought before the manor court accused of stealing 2 loaves of bread during Lent. Her defense was simple and heart-wrenching. She stole to feed her starving children, too young to understand the fasting rules. She pleaded for mercy, arguing that surely God would not want innocent babies to go hungry. The court, moved by her desperate plea, acquitted her of theft, but still reprimanded her for breaking the Lenten fast, reminding her that the needs of the soul must come before the desires of the body. For Agnes and countless others like her, the strict dietary rules must have felt like an unbearable weight in lives already burdened with hardship and hunger. In a world where every morsel was precious and survival uncertain, the idea of willingly giving up what little food was available was almost unimaginable. Yet the Church's influence on medieval food culture was not solely harsh. Monasteries and abbeys often became beacons of hope and innovation, pioneering advances in agriculture such as crop rotation, irrigation, and selective breeding. They preserved the wisdom of ancient Rome and Greece, keeping alive precious knowledge about farming and food preservation through turbulent times. Moreover, the Church played a vital role in providing food aid to the poor and hungry. Monasteries were known for their charitable distributions of bread and ale, and many operated hospitals and almshouses to care for the sick and destitute. In a world without social welfare or organized charity, the Church often stood as the only lifeline for the most vulnerable. Its teachings on charity and the sin of gluttony created a moral imperative for those with means to share their blessings with the less fortunate, weaving a fragile web of care amid the harsh realities of medieval life. Of course, this charity came wrapped in layers of paternalism and harsh moral judgment. The poor were expected not only to endure their suffering silently, but to express gratitude for the meager scraps tossed their way, as if their hunger and hardship were part of some divine plan. Yet for those trembling on the edge of starvation, even the smallest gesture of kindness could mean the fragile difference between life and death, a fleeting thread holding them to this world. As the Middle Ages wore on, the gulf between the tables of the wealthy and the poor yawned ever wider, like an unbridgeable chasm. By the late 14th and 15th centuries, Europe found itself gripped by what some have called the Little Ice Age, a cruel era of cold winds, relentless storms, and harvests battered by drought and frost. Fields that once promised life now barely yielded enough to fill empty stomachs. Food prices soared beyond the reach of ordinary folk, deepening the wounds of hunger and despair. At the same time, the shadows of the Black Death and recurring plagues swept through villages and cities, stealing millions and reshaping societies. Labor grew scarce, wages climbed, but instead of easing suffering, the privileged classes turned their eyes toward ever more extravagant displays of wealth. Lavish banquets sparkled with exotic dishes, sugar sculptures, and gilded peacocks, symbols of power flaunted amidst the growing misery beyond castle walls. Meanwhile, the poor scavenged whatever they could. Famine bread baked from desperate blends of peas, beans, acorns, and even sawdust. Wild plants foraged from forgotten woods. Desperate hunts for rodents or crows, creatures usually shunned but now forced into the human diet. Yet even in this stark landscape of inequality, sparks of hope flickered. Rebellions like the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 and the German Bonu movement in the early 16th century rose from the depths of suffering. Raw cries for justice, fairness, and the simple dignity of a full belly. Though often crushed with brutal force, these uprisings echoed an unbreakable human spirit, refusing to be extinguished. Amidst the hardship, the true champions were often the women, the silent architects of survival and sustenance. Bearing the weight of feeding families, they wielded creativity as their weapon, coaxing flavor and nutrition from the humblest of ingredients. Through folk traditions of pickling, preserving, and foraging, they passed down a living heritage of resilience, quietly sustaining their communities through the harshest seasons. In communal ovens, warmed by shared fires, and in the simple act of breaking bread together, these ordinary people cultivated a spirit of solidarity and endurance, a warmth that no frost could wither. The story of medieval food is not merely one of suffering and scarcity. It is a testament to human ingenuity, hope, and the profound power of connection. In the face of deprivation and oppression, medieval people nourished not only their bodies, but their souls, finding moments of joy and belonging in the humble sharing of a meal, a quiet rebellion against the coldness of their world, and a promise that life, no matter how harsh, could still be savored. As we look back on this distant and often difficult past, we can draw profound inspiration from their resilience and spirit. In a world still marked by inequality and hunger, their story stands as a powerful reminder of the fundamental human right to food and the urgent necessity of striving for a more just and sustainable food system. Within our own kitchens and around our tables, we honor this legacy by cherishing the abundance we enjoy and embracing the responsibility to share generously with those who have less. Ultimately, the true measure of any society is not found in the grandeur of its feasts, but in the care it takes to nourish all its people. For the vast majority of medieval Europeans, food was a daily battle against scarcity, monotony, and even danger. Yet there was one world where abundance, variety, and exquisite delicacy reigned supreme: the royal court. While peasants subsisted on gruel and stale bread, nobles reveled in the finest delicacies the land could offer. Imagine the life of the royal cook, entrusted with the monumental task of preparing sumptuous meals for the king and his court. Before dawn, the day would begin with overseeing the arrival of ingredients from far-flung lands. Wagons laden with barrels of Burgundy wine, wheels of Alpine cheese, and crates of spices from the Orient rumbled into the castle courtyard. The king's huntsmen returned with deer and boar draped over their saddles, ready to be transformed into savory roasts and pies. Inside the vast kitchens, a small army of servants moved briskly under your command. Fires roared in great hearths as spits slowly turned roasting meats to perfection. Cauldrons bubbled with fragrant stews and soups, while bakers kneaded dough for bread and pastries. The air was thick with the heady aromas of exotic spices: cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and cardamom, each worth more than its weight in silver. As the hour of the feast neared, you put the final touches on your creations: a magnificent roast swan, its graceful neck arched on a gleaming platter, an aspic studded with jewel-like fruits and adorned with shimmering gold leaf, a towering subtlety shaped like the king's coat of arms, painted in vibrant hues. Each dish was a masterpiece designed to delight the eye as much as the palate. When the noble guests filed into the great hall and took their seats, it was time for these masterpieces to be unveiled. Servants paraded the platters in, presenting each with elegant flourish to the high table. The guests marveled at the bounty before them, their awe audible in gasps and whispers. For a few splendid hours, they dined like gods, sampling delicacies from every corner of the known world. Yet even here, amidst the splendor of the royal court, the shadow of illness loomed. Despite their expense and artistry, the most sumptuous dishes could conceal deadly spoilage, and the sheer excess of the feast often led nobles to overindulge, gorging far beyond satisfaction, a cautionary reminder that even abundance carries its own dangers. It was not unheard of for a courtier to literally eat himself to death, felled by his own gluttony. So while the royal feast may have stood in stark contrast to the meager rations of the common folk, it was not without its own perils. In a world without refrigeration or food safety standards, no one was truly safe from the dangers of the dining table. Rich or poor, the medieval relationship with food was always a precarious one. Today, we can scarcely imagine the hardships our ancestors endured simply to fill their bellies. The poorest among us have access to a variety and quality of food that would have been unthinkable even for medieval kings. We can walk into a gleaming supermarket and find fruits and vegetables from every season, meats and cheeses from every continent, spices and sauces from every cuisine. We can eat what we want, when we want, without fear of famine or food poisoning. But perhaps in our abundance, we have lost something as well. The medieval peasant, for all his suffering, likely felt a deep connection to the land and the turning of the seasons. He knew intimately the sweat and toil that went into every mouthful. While we may pity him for his limited options, he would likely look upon our prepackaged, mass-produced meals with a mixture of wonder and horror. One can imagine a medieval serf transported to the snack aisle of a modern grocery store, marveling at the colorful bags and boxes stretching out before him. He picks up a shiny packet, turning it over in his weathered hands. Cheetos, he reads slowly, sounding out the unfamiliar word. Made with real cheese. He shakes his head in disbelief. Real cheese for a mere peasant? Impossible. He puts it back on the shelf and moves on, overwhelmed by the strange bounty of this new world. As we drift off to sleep, bellies full of whatever we desire, let us take a moment to reflect on the privilege of choice. Let us remember the countless generations who came before, who fought, scraped, and starved so that we might have the luxury of a full larder. And let us be grateful for the simple, everyday miracle of having enough to eat. As the sun set over the bustling port city of Venice, a weary spice merchant named Luca disembarked from his ship, his precious cargo of exotic spices from the east secured tightly in his satchel. Luca had spent months traversing the treacherous Silk Road, braving bandits, sandstorms, and searing heat to bring a taste of faraway lands to the tables of wealthy Europeans. For Luca and merchants like him, the spice trade was a lucrative but perilous endeavor. The demand for spices like pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and saffron was insatiable among the nobility, who used them to flavor their rich dishes and show off their wealth. But for the common folk, these fragrant seasonings remained an unattainable luxury, their meals sadly bland and unappetizing. As Luca navigated the winding canals of Venice to deliver his wares to his wealthy clients, he couldn't help but reflect on the stark divide between the opulent feasts of the rich and the meager rations of the poor. While nobles dined on succulent roasts flavored with exotic spices, peasants subsisted on little more than coarse bread and watery porridge, their palates never knowing the lively tang of pepper or the warm, sweet embrace of cinnamon. The life of a spice merchant was one of constant movement and danger, with fortunes won and lost on the whims of the sea and the shifting sands of the desert. Luca had seen his fair share of hardships on his journeys, attacks by marauding bandits, treacherous mountain passes, and the ever-present threat of disease. But he pressed on, driven by the promise of riches and the thrill of the unknown. As he made his final deliveries and counted his profits, Luca couldn't shake the feeling that, for all the wealth and prestige the spice trade brought him, it remained a bitter reminder of the deep inequalities that plagued medieval society. While he dined on saffron-infused stews and fragrant spiced wines, the common people went to bed with growling stomachs, their dreams haunted by the enticing aromas that wafted from the kitchens of the elite. With a heavy heart, Luca retired to his lavish villa for the night, knowing that tomorrow he would once again set sail for distant lands, chasing the promise of fortune and leaving behind a world where the simple pleasure of a flavorful meal remained an unattainable dream for most. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, a weary housewife named Matilda stirred from her slumber, her mind already racing with the countless tasks that lay ahead. For Matilda and countless other women across medieval Europe, the arrival of autumn heralded not a season of bountiful harvests and joyous feasts, but rather a time of ceaseless labor and knowing anxiety about the looming specter of winter. With the days growing shorter and the nights turning colder, Matilda knew that she had precious little time to preserve what meager crops her family had managed to coax from the unyielding earth. Every scrap of food was precious, and nothing could be allowed to go to waste, lest they face the unthinkable prospect of starvation in the bleak months ahead. As she set about her work, Matilda's mind wandered to the lavish feasts of the nobility, where sumptuous meats and exotic delicacies were consumed with want and abandon. For her and her fellow peasants, such extravagances were little more than cruel jests, taunting reminders of the vast chasm that separated the haves from the have-nots in the rigid hierarchy of medieval society. With calloused hands and an aching back, Matilda toiled from dawn until dusk, salting and smoking what little meat they had managed to raise, pickling vegetables in precious vinegar and hanging herbs to dry in the rafters. The work was monotonous and exhausting, but she couldn't afford to rest, knowing that every morsel she preserved now could mean the difference between life and death come winter. As the days wore on and the leaves began to turn, Matilda's thoughts darkened with the harsh realities that lay ahead. Despite all her tireless work, she knew winter would bring scarcity and hardship, with meals reduced to little more than coarse bread and thin, watery gruel. Day after day, hunger hovered like a shadow just beyond the door, waiting patiently to claw at the weak and vulnerable. Yet even in the face of such relentless despair, Matilda found a flicker of solace in the knowledge that her unyielding efforts might give her family a fighting chance. With a fierce determination burning deep in her heart, she pressed on, her hands cracked and raw, her spirit heavy but unbroken. In a world where famine and want were constant threats, the simple act of preserving food became an act of rebellion, an ironclad refusal to bow before the merciless cruelty of fate. As the first snowflakes drifted silently down and the bitter winter winds swept across the land, Matilda could only pray her labors would be enough. With a heavy heart and a near-empty larder, she braced herself for the long, dark months ahead, knowing that for her and countless others like her, the brutal struggle for survival was only just beginning. Far away, in a grand castle nestled among rolling hills and lush forests, an opulent feast roared to life. The great hall pulsed with raucous laughter and the clinking of goblets, as nobles from distant lands gathered to revel in an extravagant display of wealth and power. At the head of the table sat the lord of the manor, his bejeweled fingers tearing into a succulent roast swan, its delicate flesh infused with exotic spices from distant shores. Around him, tables groaned beneath the weight of countless delicacies, savory meat pies, rich stews, and decadent pastries, each a masterpiece crafted by the castle's master chefs. The air hung thick with the mouth-watering scent of roasting meats and the warm aroma of mulled wine, a sensory symphony starkly at odds with the meager rations of the serfs laboring in the fields beyond the castle walls. For these lowly peasants, such a feast was little more than a cruel mirage, a tantalizing glimpse of a world forever beyond their reach. Huddled in their drafty hovels, bellies gnawing with hunger, they could only dream of the rich flavors and sumptuous textures gracing their betters' tables. Their own meals, if they could be called that, were little more than thin gruel made from whatever scraps and leftovers they could scavenge. A few fortunate souls might possess a meager crust of bread to sustain them, but for most, even that was a rare blessing. The very thought of meat, let alone the succulent delicacies devoured by nobles, was an impossible fantasy. As the feast raged on and the wine flowed freely, the nobles grew louder and more boisterous, their laughter echoing through the stone halls, a stark, bitter contrast to the silence of hunger beyond the castle gates. They traded bawdy jokes and tales of their exploits, their faces flushed from the fire's warmth and the satisfaction of overindulgence. Laughter echoed through the grand halls, filled with the scent of rich meats and fine wine, a stark contrast to the world beyond the castle walls. There, the serfs huddled in shadows, their stomachs twisting with hunger, their hearts heavy with the bitter truth that the simple joy of a full belly or a peaceful smile was a luxury forever beyond their reach. For these weary souls, life was a relentless cycle of back-breaking toil and gnawing emptiness. Fate, cruel and unyielding, conspired to keep them bound to their lowly stations. As the last glowing embers of the feast's great fires faded, and the nobles retreated to their plush chambers, the serfs trudged back to their bleak huts, haunted by the tantalizing aromas and raucous laughter that still hung in the cold night air. With hollow hearts and empty stomachs, they prepared for another long, bitter night. Hunger their constant shadow, and the hope for a better life nothing more than a cruel mirage teasing just beyond reach. In the twisting alleys of a medieval town, Agnes, the alewife, hurried with arms full of jugs, her broad frame moving with practiced determination. Agnes was a stout woman, toughened by years of hard labor and the daily grind of brewing ale. It was a harsh existence with long hours and slim earnings, but it was the only life she had ever known. Navigating the filth and refuse that cluttered the streets, Agnes felt a gnawing guilt. Her latest batch of ale had been watered down. Grain prices had soared beyond her control, and she'd been forced to stretch her precious brew. It was a gamble, one that could land her in trouble if the authorities discovered her secret. Yet, what choice was there? Her customers, hardworking laborers and craftsmen, depended on her ale as a brief escape from their relentless drudgery. They craved its rich, hearty flavor and the warm buzz after a day's toil. But with costs eating into her thin profits, Agnes had to cut corners where she could. At the tavern, as she unloaded her wares, the guilt gnawed deeper. Pride in her craft clashed painfully with the reality she faced. Serving watered-down ale churned her stomach. Still, it was either compromise or lose everything she'd built through sweat and sacrifice. She began pouring, watching faces twist with disappointment as the ale's usual boldness fell flat. Some muttered grumbles, others demanded answers, bewildered by the subpar brew. Agnes tried to soothe their doubts, deflecting questions with practiced words, yet inside, the weight of betrayal pressed heavily on her soul. She knew what she did was wrong. But in a world where survival was a daily battle, sometimes the harshest compromises were the only way forward. As the night wore on and the crowd began to thin, Agnes finally allowed herself a moment to breathe. She surveyed the empty jugs and the meager pile of coins on the counter, a bitter reminder of the harsh realities of her trade. With a weary sigh, she began to clean up, her mind already racing with worries about how she would make ends meet in the days to come. For Agnes and countless other alewives like her, the struggle to survive in a world of scarcity and hardship was a constant battle. Each day brought new challenges and difficult choices, and the line between right and wrong often blurred in the face of desperation. But still, they persevered, driven by the hope that someday, somehow, their hard work and sacrifice would pay off, and they would finally know the taste of a better life. In the grand halls of a medieval palace, a royal cook named Guam scurried about the kitchen, his brow furrowed in concentration as he oversaw the preparations for the evening's lavish feast. Guam was a master of his craft, renowned throughout the land for his ability to create culinary masterpieces that dazzled the senses and left even the most discerning palates in awe. As he moved from station to station, barking orders and sampling sauces, Guam couldn't help but feel a sense of pride at the opulence and extravagance that surrounded him. The kitchen was a hive of activity, with scullery maids and kitchen boys scurrying to and fro, their arms laden with the finest ingredients from across the realm. There were plump capons and succulent roasts, their skins glistening with honey and spices, mountains of fresh fruits and vegetables, their colors so vibrant they seemed to leap off the platters, and delicate pastries and confections. Each one was a work of art in its own right. It was a true testament to the wealth and power of the royal court. and Guillaume reveled in his role as the mastermind behind it all. But even as he basked in the glory of his creations, Guillaume couldn't shake the unease that gnawed at the back of his mind. He knew all too well the stark contrast between the lavish feasts he prepared for the nobility and the meager scraps that passed for meals among the common folk. It was a divide that troubled him deeply, though he knew that to speak out against it would be to risk everything he had worked so hard to achieve. As the final preparations were made and the first course was served, Guillaume watched from the shadows as the nobles took their seats, their faces alight with anticipation. He saw the way their eyes widened in delight as they tasted his creations, the appreciative murmurs and nods of approval that rippled through the crowd. For a moment, he allowed himself to bask in the satisfaction of a job well done. But as the night wore on and the revelry grew more boisterous, Guillaume couldn't shake the growing sense of unease that tugged at his heart. He thought of the countless hungry mouths beyond the palace walls, the gaunt faces and hollow eyes of those who had never known the pleasure of a full belly. As the last of the dishes were cleared away and the nobles retreated to their chambers, their stomachs heavy and groaning from the excesses of the feast, Guillaume finally allowed himself a brief moment of respite. He sank against the cold kitchen wall, eyes closed, his heart burdened by the stark injustices he had witnessed throughout the evening. In that quiet, stolen moment, he couldn't help but imagine a world vastly different, a world where food was not a rare privilege hoarded by the few, but a fundamental right shared by all. He knew deep down such a world felt like little more than a dream, a distant, unreachable star glittering far beyond his grasp. Yet even so, a fragile ember of hope flickered within him that somehow, someday, the abundance he conjured in the palace kitchens might find its way beyond gilded halls to those who hungered most. Until that day, Guillaume understood his fate. He would continue his work, his hands forever marked by the conflicting stains of plenty and poverty, a living testament to the cruel inequality at the heart of the medieval world. This burden was his constant companion, a silent reminder of suffering veiled behind opulence. As we journey through the shadows and light of medieval history, through the harsh realities and the deep unfairness woven into its food culture, it is impossible not to feel profound gratitude for the relative abundance and variety that grace our tables today. The struggles faced by those who came before us, from the lowliest serfs to the most skilled artisans, echo across time, reminding us how far humanity has traveled in its quest to ensure that basic needs are met. Yet, even as we celebrate progress, it is vital to remember that hunger and malnutrition persist in many corners of the world. In moments of plenty, some still fall asleep with empty stomachs and heavy hearts, their dreams haunted by the very inequalities that troubled the medieval world so deeply. Reflecting on lessons from the past and challenges of the present, one truth remains clear. The fight for food justice is far from over. It demands the collective strength of all who believe in the fundamental human right to nourishment. This struggle will test our resolve and compassion alike. Still, in the face of these daunting challenges, we must never lose sight of the progress made or the hope that fuels our perseverance. We draw strength from the courage and resilience of those who came before, those who toiled in fields and kitchens, their hands rough and hearts heavy with burden. And we must carry forward this legacy, striving for a world where no one faces hunger, where the earth's bounty is shared fairly among all who call it home. This vision may seem fragile and distant, a fleeting dream, like wisps of steam rising from a humble bowl of gruel, but it is a dream worth chasing, a hope worth holding. But this is a dream worth fighting for, a vision powerful enough to transform the world and ignite hope in the hearts of all who hunger for a better tomorrow. So let us step forward with renewed purpose and unwavering determination. Armed with the wisdom of the past and the promise of the future, let us strive to build a world where the plenty of palace kitchens finds its way into the bellies of the poor and the joys of the harvest are shared by all who have labored to bring it forth. For in the end, the struggle for food justice transcends mere survival. It touches the very core of what it means to be human, woven through the bonds of compassion and empathy that connect us across time and space. This is a struggle demanding all our strength and courage, a fight we simply cannot afford to lose. So let us move forward with open hearts and willing hands, ready to play our part in crafting a world where every person knows the simple joy of a full belly and a contented smile. In that world, the legacy of medieval food culture will no longer be one of scarcity and deprivation, but will stand as a testament to abundance and hope, a shining example of the human spirit's enduring power to rise above even the darkest times. Of course, for the peasants who toiled endlessly in the fields from dawn to dusk, such extravagance was beyond imagining. They subsisted on the barest of meals, their bellies rarely fully satisfied. A typical meal might be a thin barley or rye porridge, known as pottage, served alongside a heavy, coarse hunk of bread. If fortune favored them, a small scrap of hard cheese or a few shriveled peas might add a hint of nourishment. Meat was a rare and precious luxury, perhaps a tough, stringy piece of salted pork saved for special occasions like Christmas or Easter. The lack of variety in the peasant diet was stark and unyielding. While the nobility feasted on delicacies from distant lands, common folk made do with the same bland staples day after day. Little broke the monotony except the changing seasons, which dictated what meager produce might be gathered. In spring, tender greens like nettles or dandelions offered a brief reprieve from the usual fare. Summer brought a handful of precious fruits, small hard apples or bitter crab apples, harvested from the wild woods. Autumn marked the harvest season, a time of relentless back-breaking labor, but also a fleeting abundance of fresh grains, and perhaps a slaughtered hog or two to prepare salted meat for the harsh winter ahead. Ah, winter, the leanest and most feared season for the medieval peasant. As days shortened and nights turned bitterly cold, families huddled close to smoky hearths, stomachs pinched by hunger. This was the harsh reality of life then, a world where survival was never guaranteed, where every meal was a small victory, and where the hope for something better sustained the weary and hungry alike. What little food remained from the harvest had to be carefully hoarded, doled out in small portions to make it last until spring. This was the time of year when the pottage grew thinner and more watery, and the bread even harder and more tooth-breaking. Starvation was a constant specter, waiting to claim the weak and vulnerable. It's hard for us to imagine such a precarious existence where a single failed crop could spell doom for an entire village. Yet, for most people in the Middle Ages, this was the grim reality of daily life. They lived at the mercy of the elements, the nobility, and the often cruel whims of fate. A mouth to feed was a burden as much as a blessing, another empty belly to fill from limited resources. Even those slightly higher up the social ladder, like skilled craftsmen or prosperous freemen, rarely enjoyed much better fare than their poorer neighbors. A bowl of pottage might be enriched with a bit of precious butter or a scrap of meat, but the fundamental monotony remained. The same could be said for the monks in their abbeys and monasteries. While they generally ate better than the laity, subsisting on bread, cheese, fish, and ale, their diet was still quite Spartan by modern standards. Rich spices and exotic ingredients were reserved for the tables of the nobility. Speaking of ale, it was the common drink of the Middle Ages, consumed by young and old alike. Clean drinking water was often scarce, and the fermentation process provided some protection against waterborne illnesses. But even this small comfort could be adulterated by unscrupulous brewers stretching their product with unsavory additives. Dishonest bakers might do the same with bread, mixing the precious wheat flour with cheaper grains, bran, or even sawdust and chalk. Such deceits were officially frowned upon and could be harshly punished if discovered. But the desperate realities of the time made them all too common. This was a world where food was a daily struggle, a relentless cycle of toil and hunger for all but a privileged few. The nobles in their grand halls, dining on elaborately prepared dishes and fine wines, seemed to inhabit an entirely different plane of existence from the grimy, half-starved peasants working their lands. It was a stark divide, one that bred resentment and sometimes open rebellion. But more often it bred a sort of grim resignation and acceptance that this was simply the way things were. A peasant's lot was to suffer and endure, to eke out a meager living from an unforgiving land and hope for a better life in the hereafter. Yet even in the midst of such hardship, there were small moments of respite and celebration. Holidays and feast days provided brief glimpses of plenty, when even the poorest might enjoy a bit of meat or a sweet pastry. Weddings, christenings, and other milestones were marked with communal meals, a chance for neighbors to come together and share what little they had. These fleeting moments of conviviality made the hard times more bearable, a reminder that even in the face of great adversity, the human spirit could endure. And endure they did, these hard-bitten medieval folk. They bore their burdens with a stoicism and tenacity that's hard to fathom from our modern vantage point. They faced each day with grim determination, knowing that survival depended on their own hard work and cunning. In a world where starvation was always lurking just around the corner, there was no room for idleness or self-pity. Perhaps that's why tales of great feasts and fantastical foods held such appeal in medieval popular culture. In a society where hunger was the norm, stories of tables groaning under the weight of succulent meats, fresh fruits, and sweet delicacies offered a tantalizing escape from reality. Myths and legends often featured magical cauldrons that never ran empty or enchanted lands where no one ever went hungry. These fanciful tales spoke to a deep, unquenchable yearning for plenty in a world defined by scarcity. But while the medieval peasant might dream of such wonders, their daily reality remained one of unrelenting hardship. The specter of famine was never far away, ready to descend at the first sign of blight or drought. And even in good times, the diet of the common folk was woefully inadequate by modern nutritional standards, heavy on grains and light on pretty much everything else. It left much of the population malnourished and susceptible to disease. This chronic malnutrition had far-reaching effects on medieval society. It stunted growth, weakened immune systems, and made childbirth even more perilous than it already was. It sapped strength and vitality, leaving peasants ill-equipped to handle the back-breaking labor that was their lot in life. It also contributed to the general sense of misery and desperation that hung over so much of the medieval world like a cloud. Yet, despite it all, life went on. Crops were planted and harvested, babies were born and raised, and the great wheel of existence kept turning. The medieval peasant might not have had much in the way of material comforts, but they had their faith, their family, and their community to sustain them. They found joy where they could, in the simple pleasures of a warm fire on a cold night, or a full belly after the harvest feast. And they endured season after brutal season with a resilience and fortitude that commands our deepest respect. So the next time you sit down to a meal, pause for a moment to savor the incredible variety and abundance before you. Spare a thought for your medieval ancestors, whose lives and deaths were dictated by the fickle whims of the harvest. Be grateful for the centuries of progress and plenty that separate us from those grim, hungry times. While the medieval peasant might have dreamed of a magical land of endless feasts, we are fortunate to live in a world where that dream is tantalizingly close to reality, a privilege we must never take for granted. The plight of the medieval peasant was further deepened by the unbalanced nature of their diets. While nobles feasted on a cornucopia of meats, fruits, and vegetables, the average serf subsisted on a meager fare dominated by grains. Porridge, gruel, and coarse bread formed the backbone of their sustenance, supplemented only by whatever small morsels they could glean from their labor. A typical peasant family might consider themselves lucky to own a cow, a pig, or a few chickens. Yet, the milk, eggs, and meat these animals provided were rare luxuries, reserved for special occasions or desperate times. More often than not, any surplus was sold or given as rent to their feudal lord, leaving little for their own table. Imagine the stark contrast between a noble's lavish feast and a serf's humble meal. In the grand castle hall, tables groan beneath roasted meats, savory pies, exotic fruits, and fine cheeses. The air is thick with the scent of saffron, cinnamon, and cloves as richly dressed lords and ladies dine with gusto. Meanwhile, in a cramped peasant hovel, a pot of thin gruel bubbles over the fire. A mother carefully portions out the meager servings, ensuring each family member receives just enough to quiet the gnawing hunger within. The children's eyes widen at the sight of a small crust of bread, a precious and rare addition to their usual fare. The unbalanced peasant diet took a heavy toll on their health. Malnutrition was rampant, weakening immune systems and leaving people vulnerable to disease. Scurvy, caused by a deficiency of vitamin C, was common, leading to bleeding gums, loose teeth, and eventually death if untreated. This stark reality reminds us how fragile life was and how deeply interconnected food, health, and survival truly are. In times of famine, known as seasons of dirt, the situation became even more dire. Crop failures due to drought, flooding, or pests could spell disaster for entire regions. With no reserves to fall back on, peasant families were left to starve, their weakened bodies succumbing to hunger and disease. One particularly harrowing tale comes from the chronicler Henry of Livonia, who described a famine in the early 13th century. He wrote of peasants driven to such desperation that they resorted to eating dogs, cats, and even the corpses of the dead. While such extreme measures were rare, they serve as a grim reminder of the precarious nature of life for the medieval peasantry. The unequal distribution of food in medieval society was a stark reflection of the rigid class hierarchy that defined the era. While the nobility enjoyed a varied and plentiful diet, the vast majority of the population lived on the brink of starvation, their meals a monotonous and meager affair. This disparity would persist for centuries, with only gradual improvements in agricultural techniques and social reforms slowly narrowing the gap. As we continue our journey through the culinary landscape of the Middle Ages, we turn our attention to another scourge that plagued the populace: adulterated food and drink. In a time before strict regulations and quality control, unscrupulous merchants and producers often resorted to cutting corners and deceiving their customers in the name of profit. One common target for adulteration was bread, a staple of the medieval diet. Bakers seeking to stretch their meager supplies of flour variety of unsavory additives. Ground acorns, chalk, sawdust, and even ground bones were among the fillers used to bulk up the loaves. The resulting bread was often dense, gritty, and lacking in both flavor and nutrition. Ale and wine, the favored drinks of the era, were also subject to tampering. In a time when clean drinking water was often scarce, fermented beverages were seen as a safer alternative. However, unscrupulous brewers and vintners would often water down their products to increase their profits, resulting in weak, insipid drinks that did little to quench the thirst or lift the spirits. The story of Agnes, the alewife, illustrates the temptation to adulterate one's wares. Agnes, a widow struggling to make ends meet, relied on the meager profits from her small brewing operation to support herself and her children. One particularly lean year, with the price of grain soaring and her customers dwindling, Agnes made the fateful decision to water down her ale, stretching her limited supply to sell more volume. At first, her deception went unnoticed, and Agnes breathed a sigh of relief as the coins clinked into her purse. However, word soon spread of the weak, tasteless brew, and her once loyal customers began to seek out other alehouses. Agnes' reputation was ruined, and she was forced to close her doors, leaving her family to face an uncertain future. While medieval authorities did attempt to regulate the quality of food and drink, enforcement was often lax and inconsistent. The Assize of Bread and Ale, a 13th century English law, set strict standards for the weight and price of these staples, but bakers and brewers found creative ways to skirt the rules. Fines and public humiliation were common punishments for those caught adulterating their products. But the lure of easy profits often outweighed the risk of getting caught. The prevalence of adulterated food and drink in medieval society added yet another layer of misery to the already challenging lives of the common people. Not only were their diets monotonous and nutritionally deficient, but they also had to contend with the constant threat of being cheated or sickened by unscrupulous producers. It was a harsh reminder of the powerlessness of the masses in the face of a system stacked against them. As we delve deeper into the realities of medieval food, it becomes increasingly clear that the romantic image of a bountiful rustic past is a far cry from the truth. For the vast majority of the population, eating was a daily struggle, fraught with scarcity, monotony, and the ever-present specter of adulteration. In a world where food was quite literally a matter of life and death, the medieval peasant had little choice but to make do with whatever meager sustenance they could scrape together. But the challenges of medieval dining were not limited to the quality and quantity of the food itself. The very environment in which people ate was often a source of discomfort and even danger. In our next chapter, we will explore the unsanitary conditions that plagued the medieval world and how they contributed to the overall misery of the era's culinary landscape. Picture, if you will, a typical peasant dwelling in the Middle Ages. The small, cramped space is shared not only by the human occupants, but also by a menagerie of livestock. Chickens peck at the dirt floor, while a pig roots in the corner, seeking out any stray scraps of food. The air is thick with the pungent aroma of unwashed bodies, animal dung, and wood smoke. In such close quarters, the line between living space and barnyard was often blurred. Livestock were kept indoors not only for their own safety, but also for the warmth they provided during the cold winter months. However, this practice came at a steep price in terms of sanitation and hygiene. Animal waste, combined with the general lack of cleanliness, created a breeding ground for disease. Flies buzzed incessantly, flitting from one filthy surface to another, carrying contamination wherever they landed. The very food the peasants depended on for survival was frequently spoiled by the unsanitary conditions under which it was prepared and consumed. The consequences were devastating. Digestive ailments, parasitic infections, and food poisoning ran rampant, slowly draining the strength and vitality from the people. Even the highest echelons of society were not spared from these dangers, as the tragic story of King John of England reveals. In 1216, during his campaign against rebel barons seeking to curb his power, King John stayed in the town of Lynn, where he indulged in a rare feast of peaches, exotic and luxurious for the time. Unbeknownst to him, the peaches had been improperly stored and were beginning to rot. Driven by hunger and a craving for these rare fruits, John ate eagerly, only to fall violently ill soon after. Racked by dysentery and fever, his health deteriorated rapidly. Though he pressed on with his campaign, his weakened state made him vulnerable. As he crossed the treacherous tidal flats of the Wash, his baggage train was lost to the rising waters, swallowing his crown jewels and treasures. The king himself barely escaped with his life, but his days were numbered. Less than 2 weeks later, he succumbed to illness. His reign ended by a simple meal of tainted fruit. While King John's fate was striking, it was far from unique in a world where food safety was a rare luxury. The medieval landscape was a minefield of hazards. From spoiled meat to contaminated water, even the very air was thought dangerous. The prevailing miasma theory blamed foul odors and bad air for the spread of disease. Medieval cities, with their narrow, winding streets piled high with festering garbage, were considered especially noxious. The stench of human waste, rotting food, and industrial byproducts mingled into a poisonous brew believed to cause illness. In truth, it was these unsanitary conditions themselves that allowed disease to flourish. The Black Death, which wiped out roughly a third of Europe's population in the 14th century, was not spread by bad air, but by fleas carrying the bacterium Yersinia pestis. The crowded, filthy conditions of medieval cities created the perfect environment for the plague to spread with devastating speed. The impact of such unsanitary conditions on medieval food culture cannot be overstated. It was not merely unpleasant smells or occasional sickness. It was a constant, deadly threat shadowing every meal. The simple act of eating, something we now take for granted as nourishing and pleasurable, was for the average peasant a risky and uncertain ordeal. In a world where basic hygiene was often absent, food became not only sustenance, but a potential vehicle for disease and suffering. Combined with the scarcity and monotony of the peasant diet, medieval cuisine was a bleak, grim reality, one that shaped daily life in ways we can scarcely imagine today. As we continue our exploration of why food in medieval times was so difficult, it is crucial to remember that the hardships we have uncovered, the lack of variety, the struggle to preserve what little they had, unbalanced diets, and unsanitary living conditions were only part of the story. Soon we will turn our focus to the church's profound influence on the culinary lives of the era, where religious doctrine often deepened the already heavy burdens borne by the average medieval diner. But before we do, let us pause to honor the incredible resilience and adaptability of our ancestors. Against overwhelming adversity, they found ways not only to survive, but to persist, leaving a legacy that echoes into our modern world. As we enjoy our meals today, let us spare a thought for the medieval peasant, whose daily battle for even the simplest sustenance stands as a testament to the unbreakable human spirit. For these peasants, life's hardships were further compounded by the strict teachings of the Catholic Church. In a society where the Church's authority was absolute, its rules shaped every aspect of existence, even the most fundamental need: food. At the heart of the Church's influence were the disciplines of fasting and abstinence. On many days throughout the year, especially during the solemn season of Lent, the faithful were commanded to abstain from meat and to limit their food intake. For the already underfed peasantry, these mandates were often unbearable. Picture, if you can, a poor peasant family during the 40 days of Lent. Subsisting on a meager diet of gruel and bread, they were now expected to give up even the small scraps of salted pork or dried fish that lent flavor and nourishment to their meals. Their empty stomachs groaned incessantly as they fought to maintain their piety despite the gnawing hunger. Consider the story of John and Matilda, a fictional yet all too realistic peasant couple. With only a tiny plot of land and a few scrawny chickens, they barely fed themselves and their 3 children in better times. When Lent arrived, they dutifully put away what little preserved meat they had and resigned themselves to a diet of thin gruel and boiled turnips. Days passed and their energy waned, tempers frayed. The children, too young to understand their hunger, wept endlessly. John, a devout man, wrestled with his faith amid this suffering. Matilda dreamed quietly of the rich stew she would cook once Lent ended. Their plight was not unique. Across the land, peasant families faced the same harsh reality. The Church's rigid rules clipped what little nourishment they could grasp. Some, driven to desperation, risked brutal punishment by poaching in royal forests. Others simply went hungry, their bodies weakening and spirits breaking beneath the weight of their devotion. This chapter in history reminds us that faith, while a source of strength, could also become an added burden, one that shaped lives through sacrifice, endurance, and an unyielding hope for a better tomorrow. Although the Church's dietary restrictions were meant to encourage spiritual reflection and penance, their impact on peasants was often severe. In a society already suffering from scarcity and inequality, fasting could mean the difference between life and death. Yet even in the midst of hardship, there were moments of hope and kindness. Monasteries and abbeys, with their large landholdings and resources, often provided food aid to the poor. Monks and nuns, bound by vows of charity and hospitality, would distribute bread and ale to the hungry, giving brief relief from the pain of an empty stomach. One story tells of a kind-hearted abbess named Hildegard, who, upon seeing the thin faces of peasants seeking help, ordered her kitchens to prepare a hearty pottage of vegetables and barley for all who asked. The grateful recipients returned home with renewed strength and a spark of hope in their hearts. However, such acts of compassion were rare in a world where the gap between rich and poor was wide and unyielding. Despite its teachings of love and charity, the Church often supported the rigid social order that kept peasants trapped in poverty and hunger. As we reflect on religion's role in shaping medieval Europe's food culture, it's important to see the complex mix of faith, power, and social inequality that defined the era. For peasants, food was not just about survival. It was a daily reminder of their low place in a world where even basic needs depended on the whims of the powerful. In our final chapter, we will explore the medieval feast, a sharp contrast to the daily reality of common people. Through this lavish display of wealth and plenty, we will understand the true depth of inequality in the era and how food served both as nourishment and a symbol of social division. But first, let us pause for a moment and imagine ourselves in the place of the medieval peasant. Their hunger, a constant companion, and their faith tested by the unyielding dictates of the Church. In their struggles and resilience, we may find a deeper appreciation for the abundance and choice that we so often take for granted in our own lives. As we have seen, the life of a medieval peasant was one of constant hardship and deprivation, with food being a daily struggle rather than a source of pleasure or comfort. Yet, in stark contrast to this bleak reality, there existed another world entirely, that of the royal feast. In the great halls of castles and palaces, the nobility would gather to indulge in lavish banquets that were a far cry from the meager affair of the common people. These feasts were far more than mere celebrations of wealth and power. They were stark symbols of the vast divide between the ruling elite and the common people. Picture the great medieval hall, alive with the flickering glow of countless candles whose warm light bathes rich tapestries and gleaming silver that decorate the walls, creating an atmosphere of grandeur and awe. The long tables groan under the weight of an endless array of sumptuous dishes, each more decadent than the last. At the very center lies a magnificent roasted boar, its crisp golden skin glistening enticingly with rendered fat. Surrounding it are platters of roasted fowl, their tender flesh bursting with exotic spices and fragrant herbs. Pies with flaky, buttery crusts conceal savory treasures of tender game, while vibrant fruits and vegetables of every color celebrate the richness of the land's bounty. This feast is a sensory masterpiece, a display not just of food, but of status and dominion. Overseeing this lavish spectacle stands the royal cook, a master artisan who has spent days meticulously preparing for the occasion. He has scoured the countryside to source the finest ingredients, ensuring that every element of the feast meets the highest standards. Yet, behind the gilded curtain of opulence, the reality for most medieval towns was far grimmer. Part 4, Adulterated Food and Drink. In the cramped, dimly lit streets, a baker named Ulrich labors tirelessly over his latest batch of bread. The harvest has been poor, grain prices have soared, and desperation has driven him to stretch his dough with fillers, ground acorns, sawdust, even chalk, to make ends meet. This was not an isolated act of deceit, but a common practice among bakers seeking to maximize profits at the expense of quality and safety. Ulrich's mind drifts to the alewife down the street, known for watering down her brew to make it last longer. In a world where clean drinking water was scarce, ale and wine were the safest, most common beverages, yet their quality was often dubious. Authorities in larger cities tried to regulate these trades. Ale tasters were appointed to ensure some semblance of quality, and bakers caught adulterating their bread risked fines or public humiliation. In London, dishonest bakers could be dragged through the streets on a hurdle, their tainted loaves hung mockingly around their necks, a spectacle meant to shame and deter. Still, such punishments were inconsistently enforced and frequently insufficient to stop the practice. Many bakers and brewers viewed fines merely as a cost of doing business, cutting corners whenever they dared to stretch their resources. This dark undercurrent of food adulteration reveals a medieval world where scarcity bred desperation, where survival sometimes demanded moral compromise, and where the pleasures of the noble feast existed alongside the harsh realities of hunger, deception, and inequality. For the average person, daily sustenance was often a gamble on dubious quality. Bread, meant to nourish and sustain, could be adulterated with inedible or even harmful fillers, substances that added weight but little safety. Ale, the common drink meant to quench thirst, was frequently so watered down that it barely refreshed, offering only the illusion of relief from thirst. This was just one more hardship in lives already burdened by relentless challenges and uncertainty. Ulrich, the baker, as he pulled yet another batch of bread from the oven, felt a pang of guilt. He knew his customers depended on him for honest, wholesome food. Yet, in a world where survival often demanded bending rules and cutting corners, he felt trapped. His small deceptions were necessary evils. He hoped they went unnoticed, and that, regardless, his bread might bring some small comfort to those who ate it, even if it wasn't quite what it seemed. Part 5. Unsanitary Conditions. In the year 1216, King John of England sat down to a sumptuous meal after a long day of hunting. Presented with an array of dishes, fresh fruit, meats, and sweet confections, he appeared to enjoy a feast fit for royalty. Yet unbeknownst to him, the peaches he consumed were spoiled, likely due to poor storage and handling. Soon after, King John fell violently ill with dysentery, a disease that ultimately claimed his life. While historians debate the exact cause, his tragic end highlights a grim truth about medieval life. Unsanitary conditions were rampant, inflicting grave consequences on health and well-being. Many medieval households kept livestock indoors for warmth and security, a practice that brought comfort but also constant contamination from animal waste and vermin. Fleas, lice, and rats were common and relentless companions, spreading disease and tormenting the human inhabitants. The situation worsened in medieval cities, where garbage and human waste were often dumped into the streets or nearby rivers without any organized sanitation system. Without any understanding of germ theory or hygiene, people lived amid filth and squalor, providing fertile ground for deadly illnesses to spread. The toll of such conditions was severe. Dysentery, like that which felled King John, was a common and often fatal disease transmitted through contaminated food and water. Other illnesses such as typhoid fever, cholera, and the infamous Black Death thrived in the same filth-ridden environment. For the average person, escape from the ever-present threat of disease was nearly impossible, and sickness was a constant shadow over daily life. Even the food they ate and the water they drank were often tainted with disease-causing microbes. In a world without antibiotics or modern medical knowledge, even a minor infection could quickly become life-threatening. The story of King John's death, while notable due to his status, was far from unique. For rich and poor alike, the specter of disease and death was a constant presence, fueled in large part by the unsanitary conditions in which they lived. It was a grim reality of medieval life, one that would persist for centuries until the advent of modern sanitation and hygiene practices. As the sun set over the medieval city, the stench of waste and decay hung heavy in the air. In the distance, the bells of the church tolled, a somber reminder of the many lives claimed by the filth and squalor of the streets. For the people of the city, it was just another day in a world where cleanliness was a luxury and disease was a constant companion. Part 6. The Influence of the Church. In a small cottage on the outskirts of a medieval village, a peasant family gathered around their meager evening meal. The fare was simple: a thin pottage made from vegetables and a scrap of salted pork, accompanied by a hard crust of bread. It was Lent, and the family was doing their best to honor the church's mandate to fast and abstain from meat during this holy season. For the peasants, the Lenten fast was a particularly difficult challenge. Their diets were already severely limited by their poverty and the scarcity of food. Giving up what little meat they had access to meant subsisting on an even more meager and monotonous diet than usual. The church's influence on medieval cuisine was significant and far-reaching. In addition to the Lenten fast, the church also mandated meatless days throughout the year, typically Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. For the wealthy, these restrictions were an inconvenience, but for the poor, they could mean the difference between a full belly and hunger. Despite the hardships imposed by the church's dietary rules, there were some small consolations. Monasteries and abbeys often provided food aid to the hungry as a form of charity. Monks and nuns would distribute bread, ale, and sometimes even meat to the poor, particularly on holy days and festivals. However, this charity was not always enough to alleviate the suffering of the peasantry. In times of extreme scarcity, some peasants resorted to poaching game from the royal forests, risking severe punishments if caught. The church, in collaboration with the secular authorities, strictly enforced these hunting bans, viewing poaching as a sin against God and a crime against the king. As the peasant family finished their meager Lenten meal, they bowed their heads in prayer, thanking God for what little they had. They knew that the fast would not last forever, and that Easter would bring a respite from the monotony and scarcity of their diet. But they also understood that the church's influence on their daily lives would continue long after Lent had ended. The cycle of fasting and feasting, of scarcity and abundance, was woven into the very fabric of medieval life, shaping not only what people ate, but how they lived and worshipped. In the grand cathedrals and humble parish churches, priests preached the virtues of fasting and self-denial. But for the peasants, these virtues were not a choice, but a necessity. They lived their lives in the shadow of the church, their stomachs growling with hunger as they prayed for a better world to come. Part 4. Adulterated food and drink. Even when food was available, there was no guarantee it would be wholesome or pure. In a world without industry regulations or safety standards, deception and corner cutting ran rampant. Imagine the plight of the humble baker eking out a living by selling his bread to the townsfolk. Desperate to stretch his meager supply of flour, he might resort to mixing in fillers like ground acorns, sawdust, or even chalk. While these additives may have bulked up the loaves, they certainly didn't make for a nutritious or appetizing meal. The bakers weren't the only culprits, though. Unscrupulous brewers and vintners were notorious for watering down their wares to maximize profits. In a time when clean drinking water was often scarce, people relied on ale and wine to quench their thirst. But the alcohol content of these beverages was often much lower than advertised, leaving the drinker unsatisfied and still parched. Picture an alewife in a bustling town surrounded by thirsty patrons clamoring for a pint. She ladles out the weak, watery brew with a guilty conscience, knowing that she's cheating her customers. But what choice does she have? The taxes are high, the grain is expensive, and she needs to make ends meet somehow. She silently thanks the heavens that most of her clientele are already too drunk to notice the deception. Yet it wasn't all driven by selfish greed. In a world plagued by scarcity and hunger, many had no luxury to be choosy. They would gladly accept a loaf of bread filled with sawdust over no bread at all. When crops failed and famine struck, people resorted to eating whatever they could find just to survive: grass, roots, even tree bark. Authorities tried to crack down on food adulterators. In 13th century England, the assize of bread and ale set harsh penalties for bakers and brewers caught cheating their customers: fines, public humiliation, and even corporal punishment. But with limited enforcement and relentless scarcity, these laws did little to stop the tide of food fraud in medieval times. So, the next time you bite into a fresh, crusty baguette or sip a cool, crisp lager, take a moment to appreciate how far we've come. In our world of abundant choices and strict quality control, it's easy to forget that for our medieval ancestors, every morsel was a gamble, and a full belly was never guaranteed. Their daily sustenance was often as much a product of deception and desperation as nourishment and pleasure. Part 5. Unsanitary conditions. Beyond scarcity, spoilage, and adulteration, medieval people also faced the constant threat of disease. Without germ theory or modern sanitation, food and water were frequently contaminated with deadly pathogens, turning every meal into a perilous gamble. Living conditions worked against any hope of food safety. Many peasants shared their small cottages with livestock, cattle, chickens, under the same roof. While this offered warmth and protection to the animals, it meant animal waste and insects were constant contaminants, fouling food, water, and surfaces. Cities were even worse. Narrow, filthy streets and crowded tenements created perfect breeding grounds for disease. Garbage, human waste, and animal carcasses piled up in gutters, fouling the air and seeping into water supplies. The stench alone was suffocating, but the true menace lay in the millions of microbes crawling unseen on every surface. It's no wonder medieval lifespans were so short, with disease cutting down young and old alike. Even the nobility weren't safe, despite their better living conditions. The tragic tale of King John of England stands as a grim warning. In 1216, on campaign, the king gorged himself on peaches and cider, only to fall violently ill and die days later. Chroniclers at the time attributed his death to gluttony, but modern historians suspect that the real culprit was more likely food poisoning from contaminated fruit. The greatest scourge of the medieval world, the Black Death, was in part enabled by the unsanitary conditions that people lived in. The plague was spread by rats and fleas, which thrived in the squalor of medieval cities and towns. With garbage and waste piling up and hygiene standards virtually non-existent, it was only a matter of time before the pestilence took hold, wiping out a third of Europe's population. It's a grim picture, but it's important to remember that medieval people weren't ignorant or unconcerned about cleanliness. They may not have understood the science behind disease transmission, but they recognized the importance of keeping food and water clean. Monasteries and hospitals often had strict hygiene rules, and medieval housewives took great pride in keeping their homes as spotless as possible. But in a world without refrigeration, proper sewage systems, or clean running water, there was only so much that could be done. Every day was a battle against the forces of decay and contamination, and all too often those forces won out. So the next time you enjoy a meal in a clean, modern kitchen, spare a thought for your medieval ancestors who fought that battle every day of their lives with the odds stacked firmly against them. Part 6. The Influence of the Church. In the medieval world, the Catholic Church loomed large over every aspect of life, and food was no exception. For the faithful, the religious calendar dictated what could be eaten and when, adding an extra layer of complexity to an already challenging food landscape. The Church mandated strict fasting and abstinence rules, particularly during the penitential season of Lent. For 40 days before Easter, meat was strictly off the menu, as were dairy products, eggs, and even olive oil in some regions. Fish was sometimes permitted, but for many poor peasants, even that was a luxury they could ill afford. Imagine the struggle of a peasant family, already living on the brink of starvation, faced with the prospect of giving up what little meat and dairy they had for the sake of spiritual purity. The growling stomachs and weakened bodies were a small price to pay, they were told, for the promise of eternal salvation. But that was cold comfort for a mother watching her children grow thin and listless from hunger. Even outside of Lent, the Church's influence could be felt in the rhythms of the weekly menu. Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays were designated as lean days when meat was forbidden. For the wealthy, this simply meant substituting fish or other luxuries. But for the poor, it often meant going without any animal protein at all. There were some small mercies, however. Monasteries and abbeys often provided food aid to the hungry as part of their mission of charity. Monks would distribute bread, soup, and ale to the needy, offering a rare respite from the roaring hunger that was a constant companion for so many. While medieval authorities did attempt to regulate the quality of food and drink, enforcement was often lax and inconsistent. The Assize of Bread and Ale, a 13th century English law, set strict standards for the weight and price of these staples. But bakers and brewers found creative ways to skirt the rules. Fines and public humiliation were common punishments for those caught adulterating their products. But the lure of easy profits often outweighed the risk of getting caught. The prevalence of adulterated food and drink in medieval society added yet another layer of misery to the already challenging lives of the common people. Not only were their diets monotonous and nutritionally deficient, but they also had to contend with the constant threat of being cheated or sickened by unscrupulous producers. It was a harsh reminder of the powerlessness of the masses in the face of a system stacked against them. As we delve deeper into the realities of medieval food, it becomes increasingly clear that the romantic image of a bountiful rustic past is a far cry from the truth. For the vast majority of the population, eating was a daily struggle fraught with scarcity, monotony, and the ever-present specter of adulteration. In a world where food was quite literally a matter of life and death, the medieval peasant had little choice but to make do with whatever meager sustenance they could scrape together. But the challenges of medieval dining were not limited to the quality and quantity of the food itself. The very environment in which people ate was often a source of discomfort and even danger. In our next chapter, we will explore the unsanitary conditions that plagued the medieval world and how they contributed to the overall misery of the era's culinary landscape. Picture, if you will, a typical peasant dwelling in the Middle Ages. The small, cramped space is shared not only by the human occupants, but also by a menagerie of livestock. Chickens peck at the dirt floor while a pig roots in the corner, seeking out any stray scraps of food. The air is thick with the pungent aroma of unwashed bodies, animal dung, and wood smoke. In such close quarters, the line between living space and barnyard was often blurred. Livestock were kept indoors not only for their own safety, but also for the warmth they provided during the cold winter months. However, this practice came at a steep price in terms of sanitation and hygiene. Animal waste, combined with the general lack of cleanliness, created a breeding ground for disease. As we reflect on the harsh realities of medieval life, the struggles for food, the dangers lurking in every meal, and the vast divide between the peasants and the nobility, we gain a deeper understanding of the resilience and endurance of those who lived in such times. Their daily battles for survival remind us how far we have come and how precious the simple act of sharing a meal truly is. Have you found this journey into the past insightful? Does it shed new light on the challenges faced by medieval people? If you enjoyed this video, please leave a comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And before you go, send some warm goodnight wishes to everyone watching. Let's spread kindness as we rest. Good night and sweet dreams.